Hello everyone, my name is Jenny Lee and I'm an English literature and humanities professor. And I'm really lucky because I get to do the things that I love the most every day. Read, write, teach, and learn something new. Okay. Whenever I have free time, I also love to travel. That's my other passion. I was born in California and I've lived in Korea, in England, and South Africa. And I've traveled all around Europe and Asia while I was in college, a little bit afterwards. So I just love seeing new places. I love meeting new people. I love learning new languages and all those other cliches that travel is supposed to be about. But I also really, really enjoy, for some masochistic reason, the feeling of being an outsider, right? Of being defamiliarized and sort of estranged from everybody, right? I've always felt like when I'm feeling the most uncomfortable, that's when I've learned the most valuable, important, and fascinating lessons in my life. So I feel very lucky to do what I do these days, but my path to my current career and interests was not at all your typical Korean Asian American story. And probably it's because my parents were not your typical Koreans in a lot of ways. When I was growing up as an only child, my mom did not want me to become a doctor, a lawyer, an engineer, a chemist, or anything like that Korean immigrant parents typically want their kids to go into. My mom wanted me to become a nun. Okay, seriously, I'm not even kidding. So my mom wanted me to become a nun, and my dad, he just wanted me to become whatever my mom told me to. Okay. You see, my mom herself used to be a nun. She was a Catholic nun in Korea back in the 60s. So I'm going to show you a couple pictures of her just because they're pretty adorable. So as you can see here, she's the nun. That's my mom. It's so weird looking at that. But this is her with the rest of, actually half of her family. She was part of a very, very large family, one of the younger members. So that was my mom, and I love this photograph of her because there's this, she's in a bus, everything's dark, can't really see everybody else, but she's just singing with joy for some reason, right in the back of the bus there, up in the back right corner. So my mom, very recently, she's actually started to open up and talk about her experiences, right? And so she's told me stories about how she and her fellow sisters, they actually traveled around the world back in the 60s, right? So they visited places like Pakistan and Ireland, and they went there to do charity work and start new communities. And then she went to college in the US to study nursing, and then she went back to Korea to get her master's, I can't remember, like education or something, at Seoul National University, and then she taught in Jeju-do for a couple years. And I really realized how many opportunities that she had that very few young, single Korean women at that time had, right? Because she was a sister. Right? So it was a very feminist moment, right, for me. So anyway, obviously she left the convent. And not because of my dad, right, just to be clear. But eventually she did meet and marry my dad, and he himself actually has a very harrowing personal history. He was born in 1932 during the Japanese colonial occupation of Korea, and his family moved from Seoul to a village in northern part of Korea, now in North Korea, called Hanpyeong. After World War II, when Korea was divided and the Soviets took over the north, my dad and his older brother escaped from their home, and they ran south on foot. They slept in the woods, and they were foraging for food until they finally reached Seoul. My dad was only 13. Okay? I can't even imagine the hardships that he and his brother went through. Right? Even now when I think about it, it breaks my heart. When the Korean War began in 1950, my dad lied about his age to join the army, and he ended up fighting in the war on the southern side. Later, he rose to become a lieutenant colonel in the ROK Army. So here's a picture of him, right? Last year, this is really wonderful. My husband and I, we took my dad to Washington, D.C., because there was a 60th anniversary sort of commemoration ceremony that celebrated kind of, not the end, but the signing of the armistice, right, of the Korean War. President Obama, he gave a speech thanking all the Korean War veterans, right? So in this photo, my dad, he's on the right, he's standing with General Jung Seung-jo, who at that time was the head of the Korean Army. In this next photo, you can see my dad talking his ear off. So anyway, I took a couple pictures, and then later on, I knew he was a general, obviously, because of his regalia, but I was looking at the news, and this guy was standing next to Obama during the entire ceremony, right? And I'm like, oh my God, I looked him up. I said, Dad, you gave advice to the #1 guy in the Korean army, right? Because he was actually the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And he's like, I know. And I said, well, what did you tell him? He's like, well, he's a young guy. He was born after the war. He doesn't know anything, right? And I was like, what did you say? And then, his phone went silent and he said, I can't tell you what I told him. It's top secret. I love my dad. He's so great. Anyway, my parents were a lot older than most of my friends' parents, and so they gave me different kinds of pressures. I am very glad and I feel very lucky that they never forced me to pick certain majors over others, partly because they were so distracted and removed from present-day college, American college realities. They didn't know how to advise me, right? They were too busy at the time running a liquor store in LA. And they were struggling financially all the time, just like a lot of other Korean immigrants who were running liquor stores, right? And who got hit by the LA riots, right, back in the early 90s. Anyway, all my mom wanted me to do was to go to heaven, right? She just really, really, really wanted me to go to heaven. So I had no idea or direction about what I needed to do on earth, right, in my life here. However, two things that I've always loved to do was to write and to read. So I've been writing in journals, diaries since I was 5, and here I actually went through for this and I found my very first entry. That's the first thing that I ever wrote, right? I mean, as you know, in my journals. So I went to school, I liked to go to kindergarten. It was the first day of school, right? So despite what this entry might seem to suggest, I actually became a great speller too. So here's a very nerdy picture of me and my parents, and I won 2nd place in the Orange County Spelling Bee. This was in the Korean newspaper, and I was actually really pissed when they took this picture because I just lost. I was 1 word away from the nationals. And actually, this was the 2nd year in a row that I was beat by the same girl. She was a Chinese girl, Chinese-American girl, with 1 brown eye and 1 blue eye, and I've never forgotten her face. So anyway, I wrote a lot. And the other thing that I love to do, I love to read. I read anything that I could get my hands on. I didn't care what the subject was, although I always was partial to good stories. During senior year of high school, I got really, really stuck on books about jazz and Sigmund Freud. So when I went to college at Berkeley, I played piano for musical theater groups, and I also majored in psychology. And then after that, I proceeded to change my interests and my majors like every month, right? Over and over again, depending on whatever I was reading and what I was into. Eventually, I did end up graduating, and I graduated with a combined degree, I have to remember this, in psychology, comparative literature, and philosophy, with a minor in English, and I wrote my thesis on modern Korean short stories, so I don't know. After I graduated from college, I had no idea what to do with myself. At one point, I thought I would become an expert in hip-hop studies, and I'm still working on that. So I traveled some more. I taught in Korea for a couple years. I read and wrote a lot, and then I found myself in South Africa to get a master's in English at the University of Cape Town. Right? And so here's a picture of Cape Town's Table Mountain, Lion's Head, and I actually lived right behind Table Mountain, so right behind all this. It was beautiful. Right. And the reason why I ended up in South Africa was totally random, like everything else. I was at a bookstore in Seoul, and at Kyobo Mungo, if anyone's familiar. And there I found a book of political essays by a South African writer named Nadine Gordimer. And I really, really loved this book. I loved her writing. So I got in touch with a professor at the University of Cape Town who was an expert on Gordimer, and I ended up being her student for a year, and I wrote my master's thesis on South American, South African, and a couple Asian writers who won the Nobel Prize in Literature. So that was really cool. And years later, I found out that my advisor was married to the famous South African writer and Nobel Prize winner J.M. Coetzee. She was married to him this whole time. She never told me, even though she was advising me on all this. I found this out myself through Wikipedia, which, contrary to what your English teachers say, is actually an amazing resource. Just don't ever cite it in your papers. Okay. So anyway, eventually I ended up by this long, circuitous route here in Chicago. My parents actually ended up moving here too, totally separate from me. They live at a retirement community run by Catholic nuns, and my mom feels very, very at home there. After I moved to Chicago, I taught at a community college for a couple of years, and then I went back to school to get a PhD in English. I went to Northwestern. As usual, I had no idea what I wanted to study, so my professors decided for me. You were raised Catholic, right? You like myths? So they said, why don't you study classical and medieval literature? And I remember that when I was younger, I really loved the stories of saints' lives and legends about chivalry and romance, and I loved all those Greek myths with all those terribly behaving gods. So I thought that would be a great idea. So I ended up studying Latin, Greek, French, and Middle English, and I wrote my dissertation on confession and how it influenced writers all the way up to the present day, who now confess way too much about themselves on blogs and Facebook. And according to my research, you can thank St. Augustine and Geoffrey Chaucer for that. So, and here's a picture of me with my parents at my graduation last year. That day I was awarded Best Dissertation of the Year, so by my department, so that was cool. So I guess the one continuous thread throughout all of this is that I was always fascinated by the intersections between art and culture, okay? Both old and new, and I've always plunged myself really fully into whatever captured my imagination at the time. But even now, right, my passions and interests are still evolving. During grad school, I realized that while I liked academic research, I loved teaching. I loved it even more. And so now I get to do that for my day job, right, at the College of Lake County. Harkening back to my time volunteering throughout high school and college, I also got involved with social justice organizations that serve low-income immigrant communities, right, particularly women, children, and the elderly. I'm also committed to advocating for Asian American issues at large, including as a writer for Hyphen magazine, as well as at the college I teach at, where last month I've been awarded a grant to start an Asian American studies program there, right, to teach history, culture, and literature. In between, I write regularly on a blog, and I hang out with my family and friends, I take photographs, I try to make something grow out of my garden, and I travel with my husband whenever we get the chance. I'm almost done. Now, I don't know how I'm doing with this whole heaven thing, so sorry, Mom, but I do know that everything that I'm doing these days makes me feel very, very blessed. If there's anything that I've learned over the years, it's this. Don't ever feel like you have to know what you want to do with your life, okay? And that you don't ever feel like you have to get there by some sort of straight and narrow path. You might keep getting distracted, and that's okay, because it may very well lead to awesome new discoveries. You have to try new things and make mistakes in order to change and grow, right? I'm still making mistakes, and I'm still changing and growing, like every day. And if something makes me feel uncomfortable and out of place, I welcome it, right? Just bring it on. So I wish a messy, wonderful path for all of you guys, and thank you so much for your time.